I spent 18 months restoring a $750,000 cottage, a wedding gift for my daughter. Then a number I didn't know texted me, "Don't sign that property over. Stop." I thought it was a wrong number and called back. What I heard next changed everything. I was standing in the front yard of a $750,000 beach cottage on Folly Beach, South Carolina, holding a hand-painted wooden sign that read, "Welcome home, sweetheart," when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Don't sign that property over to your daughter. You're making the biggest mistake of your life." I read it twice, then a third time. The morning sun was coming up over the Atlantic, painting the whole sky orange, and I was supposed to be the happiest I've been in 5 years. 11 days until my daughter's wedding. 11 days until I gave her the keys to the cottage I'd spent 18 months restoring with my own 2 hands, and some stranger was telling me to stop. I almost deleted it. Instead, I called back. It rang 7 times. No answer. I tried again and again, standing there in the seagrass with that welcome sign still in my hands. I called 11 times before I finally gave up. I told myself it was a wrong number. I told myself some prank caller had no idea what this cottage meant to me, or what it had cost me, or whose memory I'd poured into every repainted shutter and every refinished floorboard. My wife would have loved this place. She passed 5 years ago from pancreatic cancer, never got to see me finish it. But she was the one who'd pointed to this little rundown cottage the last summer we drove out to Folly Beach together, her wrapped in a blanket in the passenger seat even though it was July. "That one," she'd said, "if you ever want to do something with your hands again, do that one." I bought it 8 months after her funeral. It took 18 months and more money than I want to admit, but I turned a sagging, salt-rotted wreck into something she would have been proud of. I built my construction development company over 35 years in Charleston. 35 years of early mornings and missed dinners and sacrifices I told myself were for the family. My daughter grew up watching me leave and waiting for me to come home. I owed her something that no contract and no closing document could capture. I wanted to give her the start I never gave myself. The cottage was my apology and my promise at the same time. I set the welcome sign against the porch railing and drove home. I tried that number 6 more times before midnight. It rang and rang into nothing. 3 days later, my phone rang at 1 p.m. on a Thursday, a number I didn't have saved. I answered on the second ring. "Ray?" The voice was older, rougher than I remembered. "Ray Mitchell?" "Yes." "Who is this?" A pause that felt longer than it was. "It's Dennis Pruitt." I sat down slowly. Dennis Pruitt, my former project manager from the early 2000s, a man I'd worked shoulder to shoulder with for nearly a decade before he left Charleston to take care of his mother up in Greenville. We'd exchanged Christmas cards for a few years after that. Then nothing. It had been over 12 years. "Dennis." I didn't know what else to say. "I know it's been a long time. I know this is coming out of nowhere, but Ray, I sent you that text last week. I needed to be sure you'd call back before I said anything." His voice was careful, measured. "I'm back in Charleston now, about 8 months. I've been working at Palmetto Title, doing closings." I felt something cold settle in my chest. "What does that have to do with my daughter's wedding?" 2 weeks ago, he said, I was finishing up a closing at the office. Late, maybe 7:30. I was the only one left in the building, or I thought I was. The conference room door wasn't latched all the way. He stopped. "Ray, your son-in-law came in with a woman I didn't recognize and an attorney I've seen around town. They were there for almost an hour." I heard everything. I set my glass of water on the counter. Didn't trust my hands to hold it. "Everything about what?" "They were talking about the cottage." Dennis's voice dropped. "About the deed transfer. The woman kept saying the timing had to be perfect, that it had to go through before the honeymoon ended. The attorney was explaining how a property received as a gift during a marriage is handled differently in a divorce proceeding if the receiving spouse controls it alone." My mouth went dry. "Divorce?" They laughed about how long it would take. Said 18 months was plenty. The woman said, and I'm trying to remember this exactly, she said, "By the time the old man figures out what happened, the deed will have been transferred twice, and there won't be anything left to argue about." I stood up from the kitchen table without meaning to. "Who was the woman?" "I didn't know her then." Dennis paused. "But," I looked up the attorney afterward. "And Ray, the woman was his sister." I was quiet for a long moment. "His sister?" "She's an estate attorney out of Columbia. She changed firms about 4 years ago. Before that, she worked under a different name." Another pause. "Ray, do you remember a man named Gerald Stokes?" The name landed like something physical. "Gerald Stokes?" I hadn't heard that name in almost 20 years, and had spent considerable effort not thinking about it. Gerald Stokes had come to me in 2005 with an investment proposal, a mixed-use development near the waterfront, money that should have doubled in 3 years. I'd done my due diligence, found problems with the permit applications, discovered he'd falsified environmental assessments. I'd walked away from the deal, and because I couldn't in good conscience stay quiet, I'd filed a complaint with the State Contractors Board. Gerald Stokes lost his contractor's license. His development company folded within a year. I'd heard years later that he'd never recovered financially, that he died in 2018 with very little left. "Dennis," I said slowly, "what was Gerald Stokes' daughter's name?" "Patricia," he said, "but she goes by something else now." I sat back down. "And the man my daughter is marrying is Gerald Stokes' son?" "Yes." I stayed in my office until 2 o'clock in the morning, just sitting in the dark with the family photo on my desk staring back at me. My daughter at her college graduation. The two of us squinting in the afternoon sun. She had her mother's eyes and her mother's laugh, and I had spent 5 years trying to be enough for both of us. When had she met him? 18 months ago, a mutual friend's birthday party. He was charming. He remembered things she mentioned in passing. He called when he said he would. I had liked him. I had genuinely liked the man. I went to my filing cabinet at 7 o'clock the next morning. My daughter had asked me back in February to sign some paperwork updating the property transfer documentation. "Just making sure everything is in order before the wedding, Dad." My attorney said it's cleaner if the deed language is finalized beforehand. She'd brought a folder, left it on my desk, came back an hour later to pick it up. I had signed where she showed me without reading every page because she was my daughter and I trusted her the way you trust someone you raised. I found my copies in the back of the second drawer. I spread them across my desk. The deed transfer language was there, yes, but buried on page 4 of a 6-page document was a clause I had never discussed with anyone transferring management authority over the property to something called Coastal Legacy Holdings LLC in the event of a change in the primary occupant status. I grabbed my laptop. South Carolina Secretary of State Business Registry. Coastal Legacy Holdings LLC, registered February 2024. Managing member, one name I didn't recognize. Registered agent, a Columbia law firm. I searched the firm's associate page. There she was, same eyes as her father. Different name. I called my attorney at 8 o'clock sharp and was in his office by 9 o'clock. I had used Robert Haynes for 30 years. He had handled every major transaction in my business life, drafted my wife's estate documents, closed the original purchase on the Folly Beach cottage. He was one of those men who spoke slowly and billed by the hour and was worth every cent. He listened to everything without interrupting. When I finished, he put his pen down and looked at me over his reading glasses for a long moment. "Ray, how much does your daughter know about this?" It was the question I'd been turning over since 2 o'clock in the morning. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. "That matters," he said. "It matters significantly." He pulled the documents toward him and started reading. "This LLC structure is cleverly done. If the divorce had proceeded on their timeline, the property management clause would have allowed Coastal Legacy to lease the cottage, encumber it, potentially force a sale. By the time you understood what had happened, the asset would have been diluted." He looked up. "Do you know why the sister changed her name?" "To distance herself from her father's history in this market. She couldn't practice under Stokes in South Carolina without my past complaint coming up in background checks." Robert nodded slowly. "You need a private investigator before we do anything else. And Ray," he waited until I was looking at him. "You need to find out what your daughter knew and when she knew it. Because if she was a willing participant, that changes everything. And if she wasn't, it changes everything in a different direction." I hired Carol Webb, an investigator I'd used for due diligence on business partners. I gave her 2 names in 48 hours. She called back in 36. The man my daughter was marrying had $178,000 in personal debt, 2 credit cards maxed in the last 2 years, a car loan he was behind on, a personal loan from a private lender at a rate that suggested he'd been turned down by every bank. His sister's firm had no major clients in South Carolina. She'd relocated from Charlotte 4 years ago, right around the time my daughter had started posting on social media about her work in Charleston. "She found your daughter first," Carol said, "not the other way around." My throat tightened. "What do you mean?" "The mutual friend who introduced them at that birthday party. Her name is Leanne Carr. I tracked her back to a yoga studio in Mount Pleasant where your daughter was a regular member. Leanne Carr is a client of Coastal Legacy Holdings." A pause. "I don't think the birthday party was accidental." I sat with that for a long time. My daughter had been hunted. The question was whether she'd eventually agreed to the hunt. I needed to find out. And I needed to do it without tipping my hand. I invited her to dinner at my house that Sunday. The way I always did every few weeks. Just the two of us. The way it had been since her mother died. I cooked the rosemary chicken she'd always asked for growing up. Opened a bottle of wine. And I listened to her talk about centerpieces and catering and the honeymoon they were planning in Portugal. And while she was helping me clear the table, I excused myself to the hallway and set my phone to record. Then placed it on the bookshelf near the dining room doorway where it would catch sound clearly. I went back to the kitchen and made coffee. I said, as casually as I could manage, "Sweetheart, remind me. What was the name of the LLC your attorney set up for the property management? I need it for my accountant." She froze. Just for a half second. Then she said, "Coastal Legacy. I told you about it back in February." "Right," I said. "And who manages that? Is it your attorney directly? Or someone at the firm?" She turned to look at me. "Dad, why are you asking?" "Just making sure my records are straight before the wedding." I smiled. "You know how I am about paperwork." She looked at her hands for a moment. "His sister handles most of the administrative side. She's been really helpful with everything." "His sister?" I repeated. "The one who's an estate attorney?" "Yes." She paused. "She knows what she's doing, Dad. I promise everything is set up correctly." I nodded and handed her a mug of coffee. "I'm sure it is." I picked up my phone from the shelf 20 minutes later when she went to the bathroom. I had what I needed. Not a confession, but enough. I was back in Robert's office Monday morning with the recording and Carol's full report. He listened to the recording twice. He reviewed the report. Then he set everything down and folded his hands on his desk. "Ray, I want you to hear me clearly." He spoke the way he always spoke, measured and quiet. "Your daughter may have known about the LLC. She may have known about the intent to control the asset, but there is a meaningful difference between knowing that and being the architect of a fraud scheme. Gerald Stokes' son grew up watching his father lose everything. And his sister has spent years in a career built around finding legal mechanisms to recover what she believes her family lost. Your daughter walked into a relationship with a man who is already working a long game. Whether she understood the full scope of it, I can't say. But I will say this." He looked at me directly. "Before you decide who the enemy is, make very sure you know where the line is." That mattered. It mattered in ways I was still working out when I walked back to my car. Tuesday, Robert filed a motion to void the property transfer clause in the signed documents, arguing fraudulent inducement. A judge granted a temporary hold on any transfers pending review. Tuesday afternoon, Robert contacted the South Carolina Bar Association with a formal complaint against the estate attorney, citing conflict of interest and misrepresentation of client relationships. Wednesday, Carol confirmed that the attorney at the Palmetto title meeting had a prior disciplinary record in North Carolina for advising clients on transactions that circumvented court-ordered judgments. Thursday morning, I changed my will. My estate to the Low Country Housing Trust, a non-profit I'd supported for years, except for a specific bequest I added for Dennis Pruitt, who had picked up a phone after 12 years of silence because he thought it was the right thing to do. I called Dennis that afternoon and offered him a position managing the restoration project I'd been planning on 2 properties in North Charleston. He said yes before I finished the sentence. I spent Friday alone at the cottage, walking through every room, touching the work I'd done with my hands, the reclaimed heart pine floors, the built-in bookshelves I'd measured and cut myself over 4 straight weekends, the clawfoot tub I'd found at an estate sale and refinished over 3 evenings in my garage while my daughter sat on a folding chair beside me and told me about her week. She had been there for so much of it. She'd brought me lunch on Saturdays. She'd helped me pick the exterior color, standing at the paint counter for 40 minutes debating between 2 shades of soft blue before I finally said, "Pick whichever one your mother would have liked." She'd pointed to the one on the right without hesitating. I stood in the kitchen of that cottage for a long time. The rehearsal dinner was Saturday evening at a restaurant on East Bay Street. 40 guests, immediate family, close friends, long wooden tables, candlelight, the easy laughter of people who didn't know anything was wrong. The man my daughter was marrying arrived with his sister on his arm. She was poised, well-dressed, wearing the patient smile of someone who believed they were 24 hours from finishing a plan they'd been building for years. She shook my hand warmly and said it was wonderful to finally spend time with me. "Likewise," I said. Dinner was served. I sat 3 seats from my daughter and watched her laugh and touch her fiancé's arm and look happy in a way that was either genuine or the most convincing performance I'd ever witnessed. I had spent the week trying to decide which it was, and I still didn't know. Halfway through the main course, the restaurant manager signaled that it was time for toasts. The best man went first. The maid of honor went second. Then my daughter's fiancé's father stood and said a few words about building a life together that made several people tear up. Then it was my turn. I stood with my glass, and the room went quiet the way rooms do when the father of the bride is about to speak. I looked at my daughter first. She was watching me with her mother's eyes, and I thought, not for the first time that week, that what I was about to do was going to cost me something I could not calculate in advance. Then I looked at his sister. Her expression was composed, expectant. "I've been thinking a lot this week about what it means to build something," I said. "I spent 35 years in construction. I know what goes into a foundation. I know the difference between something built to last and something built to look good long enough to sell." The room was very still. About 12 days ago, I received a text message from a number I didn't recognize. It told me not to transfer my cottage to my daughter's name. I almost ignored it. I paused. I'm glad I didn't. I saw the color change in his sister's face. Her composure held, but just barely. "I'd like to tell everyone here what I found when I started looking." I reached into my jacket pocket and set a single folded document on the table. Coastal Legacy Holdings LLC was registered in February of this year. The managing member is the woman sitting at this table who has been introduced to my family as a helpful estate attorney. I looked at her directly. Her legal name until 2019 was Patricia Stokes. Her father was Gerald Stokes, whose contractor's license I helped revoke in 2005 after I discovered he had falsified environmental assessments on a waterfront development. Someone at the far end of the table made a sound. The man my daughter was marrying had gone completely still. The management clause buried in the documents I signed in February would have given Coastal Legacy authority over my cottage after a change in primary occupancy. The attorney who drafted those documents has a disciplinary history in another state. The mutual friend who introduced my daughter to the man she planned to marry tomorrow is a client of Coastal Legacy Holdings. I let that settle. This was not a romance. It was a recovery operation, planned over years, executed through my daughter. The room was absolutely silent. I looked at my daughter. She had both hands flat on the table. She was looking at me, and her face was doing something complicated that I couldn't read from where I was standing. "I have spent this week trying to understand how much she knew," I said quietly. And I said it directly to her. "I don't have a clean answer, but I know that what's been done to her is not the same as what's been done to me. And I know there's a difference." Two officers who had been positioned near the restaurant entrance moved toward the table. The estate attorney stood up before they reached her. Her composure finally broke. Not into tears, but into something colder and more controlled. "You destroyed my father," she said. The room was so quiet the words carried to every corner. "Everything he built. Everything we had. Your father falsified documents that would have endangered buyers who trusted him," I said. I reported what I found. That was the right thing to do. I looked at her steadily. "I'm sorry for what it cost your family. I mean that. But it doesn't change what you did here." She was escorted out with her brother beside her, both of them quiet now. The performance finished. The rehearsal dinner ended the way all things end when the ground shifts without warning. People gathered in small clusters, speaking in low voices, some of them leaving quickly and others staying as though uncertain whether to go. My daughter was sitting alone at the end of the table when I came to her. The candles were burning low. She didn't look up right away. When she did, her eyes were dry. "How much did you know?" I asked. I sat down across from her, and I kept my voice as even as I could. She was quiet for a long time. "I knew the LLC was being set up." Her voice was careful. "He told me it was an asset protection structure, standard. I didn't ask enough questions." She stopped. "I should have asked more questions." "Yes," I said. "You should have. I didn't know about his father. I didn't know who his sister was before." She pressed her lips together. "I don't know if you believe me." I studied her face, her mother's eyes looking back at me. "I don't know yet, either," I told her honestly. "But I want to." She nodded slowly. That was enough for that night. I drove home alone on the bridge over the Stono River with the windows down and the April air warm and heavy with salt. The wedding was called off before midnight. The man my daughter had been planning to marry for 18 months was answering questions in a downtown precinct while his sister consulted an attorney who wasn't family. The cottage was still mine, every floorboard, every repainted shutter, every reclaimed pine plank I'd cut and laid by hand. I drove out to Folly Beach before sunrise. Let myself in with the key that had never left my pocket. Stood in the kitchen in the dark and listened to the ocean, which is the same sound it's always been, patient and indifferent to everything people build and lose. My daughter called at 8 o'clock in the morning. I answered. We talked for a long time. Not about forgiveness, not yet. About what she knew and what she chose not to look at and what it means when you trust someone because you want to and stop short of the questions that might give you a harder answer. She was honest, not all the way honest, but honest enough that I could see the shape of the truth we'd have to build together over the coming months. I told her the cottage was still hers. Someday, when we'd done the work, when I was certain she understood what I'd built and why, and when she understood what it had cost me to build it. She said she understood. I said I hoped that was true. I set my phone on the kitchen counter and stood at the window looking at the water. Dennis Pruitt was starting his new position on Tuesday. Robert Haynes was filing the final injunction paperwork that afternoon. The Bar Association complaint would move through its process over the next several months. Gerald Stokes had died in 2018 with very little to his name because he'd made choices I couldn't let stand. I had never enjoyed that outcome. I had filed my complaint 20 years ago because staying quiet felt like participating, not because I had any interest in watching a man lose everything. His daughter had taken that loss and sharpened it into something she carried for 20 years until she found a way to use my own love for my child as the mechanism of my destruction. I thought about the welcome sign I'd leaned against the porch railing 11 days ago, before any of this. Hand-painted, "Welcome home, sweetheart." It was still out there. I went to retrieve it and brought it inside, set it against the kitchen wall. My wife would have told me that being right is the beginning of the conversation, not the end of it. She had always been better at that than I was. She would have told me that what I did that night in the restaurant was necessary and that what I did the morning after, answering when my daughter called, was more important. She would have been right on both counts. I had spent 35 years building things designed to outlast me, structures that required solid foundations, honest materials, work done the right way even when no one was watching. My daughter was somewhere in the middle of understanding what that meant. I was somewhere in the middle of understanding what it would take to rebuild something that had been compromised before the foundation ever cured. The ocean outside was patient. I had time. If you're still with me at the end of this story, I want to ask you something. When someone uses the people you love most as the instrument of your harm, how do you separate the wound from the wound maker? How do you look at your child and hold two things at once, the love that doesn't stop and the accountability that can't be skipped? I don't have a clean answer. I had justice on a Saturday night and a conversation with my daughter on a Sunday morning, and neither one of those things was sufficient by itself. Both of them together were a beginning. The cottage is sitting on Folly Beach right now with the April light coming through the windows I refinished by hand. The keys are in my pocket. Someday, when we're ready, I'll hand them over.